To present Joseph Dobrian, who will read to us from his new novel, Ambitions. Ambitions just got a terrific review in today's Iowa City Press Citizen. Jeff Charisse Carlson says, like Anna Karenina, Joseph Dobrian's new novel, Ambitions, should be required reading in premarital counseling or pre-parenting classes. Like Leo Tolstoy 140 years before him, Dobrian understands intimately the profound truth within the axiom, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And like the 1,000-page Russian masterpiece, Dobrian's 440-page Ambitions provides a veritable catalog of various unhappy marriages and parent-child relationships. He continues to say that he found it so hard to put down that he made it through 300 pages in the first night and had to go to work bleary-eyed the next day. Joseph Dobrian is the author of the novel Willie Wilden and the essay collection Seldom Right But Never in Doubt. He grew up in Iowa City and moved back in 2010 after spending most of his adult life in New York City, where he worked as a freelance journalist and political activist. You may also know him as perhaps the most meticulously dressed attendee of our readings here at Prairie Lights. We are happy to have him here tonight on the other side of the lectern to talk to us about his new book. Please welcome Joseph Dobrian.
Thank you for that introduction, and my thanks to all of you for coming out here. Maybe not all writers of novels write to show off, but that's what I do, and so this is what makes it worthwhile. So I'm just going to start at the start of the book. I use what I thought was kind of an interesting narrative device throughout the book. The story is narrated by this bald guy at the front, and he starts out by introducing himself, but then he tells most of the rest of the story in the third person, saying, Andy did this, Andy said that. And every so often he'll just step back from the narrative and turn to the reader and say, now wait a second, what's going on here? So with that in mind, I'll just start at the beginning and go on till you can't stand anymore. Let's start with me, Andy Palinkas. I lived next door to the Wainwrights for 26 years, and I watched a lot of this story go down. What I didn't see, I heard about, with varying degrees of accuracy. The story's not about me, it's about the Wainwrights, and especially about the youngest child of that family, Christine, who disappeared in June of 2008. It surprises me how little of this story I've had to make up and how much of it I've been able to piece together from other people's accounts, from gossip, from rumor. I'm not on oath as I tell it. Sometimes I'll be stating the plain facts. Sometimes I'll be repeating what was common report. Sometimes I'll be conjecturing, speculating, postulating, just guessing at what might have happened. Guessing at what one person or another might have been thinking or feeling. My imagination will tell me this is how it must have been, or pretty close. In any town, you'll find a few people who know practically everyone in that town and the story behind each of them. In State City, Iowa, which has 75,000 people, counting the students at State University, it would be an exaggeration to say of any one person that he knew everyone, let alone claim that he had all the dirt on everyone. But I know a lot of the people here. I know a lot of the dirt, and I can imagine a lot more. The townies complain about the students. They're noisy, they're rowdy, they party too much. But without State University, State City wouldn't be the smallest big city in the world, as we like to call it. State University has a terrific teaching hospital, first-rate school of engineering. Its sports teams, the River Cats, tend to be strong. State University also has a world-famous school of music. State City has been designated by UNESCO as one of 6 cities of music, along with Vienna, Sydney, Milan, Dresden, and Caracas. The School of Music's headquarters is the Janscom Center, a massive structure that sits on the banks of the State River and combines indoor and outdoor performance spaces with classrooms and rehearsal studios. The Janscom Center is a regional equivalent of Tanglewood in Massachusetts, or Lincoln Center in New York, or the Sydney Opera House. Janscom is almost a holy place in State City. State City is in eastern Iowa, which was mostly settled by Germans, Irish, Czechs, and Slovaks in the 1840s. Names like Cermak, Blaha, Stasny, Prohaska, Kerchak, Scrofula, Spatula, been around ever since then. State City is so ethnically mixed now, though, that on any given day, an Aziz might be sitting next to a Zylstra on the bus. You'll see Africans with tribal scars and covered Muslim women, lots of people from the Eastern Hemisphere. This is the town that Christine Wainwright grew up in and disappeared from. For most of her life, Christine was the kind of girl you wouldn't have noticed. Ordinary looking, not especially talented or bright, from a family that was perfectly respectable and completely unremarkable. But by the time she'd turned 17, when she was finishing her junior year of high school, Christine was getting noticed as a singer. People who knew what they were talking about, and there were a lot of those in State City, were saying that she might have it, real star quality. Then she went missing. One of the strangest bits of gossip to come out of that case was that this normal-seeming teenage girl had as her closest friend a man 43 years older than she, a man literally old enough to be her grandfather. This feature ran in the State City Examiner a few days before Christine's disappearance. Like a lot of newspapers in towns the size of State City, the Examiner publishes occasional profiles of local business people, community activists, or village idiots. And on this day, it was this village idiot's turn. I'd say it provides a better description of me than I could have written myself. The State City Examiner, June 1st, 2008. Meet Andy Palinkas. Andrew Gabor Palinkas has made it his purpose and passion to send people out of his store and into the world looking good. He knows how to dress, and he teaches his customers to do the same. I dress the way a lot of guys in State City wish they dared to dress, said the 60-year-old owner of Rosen's Men's Store in downtown State City. I won't pretend that I don't dress well. My attire isn't just something that goes with my business, it's part of who I am. A tall, husky, tough-looking man with a meticulously shaven head, Andy's a familiar figure in State City, with his upright posture, sharp double-breasted suits, crusty personality, and, as he puts it himself, the only pair of piercing green eyes in the world. He's often seen at State University sporting events and at the Janscom Center for Classical Music concerts and recitals. You'll also see him on stage in productions by the State City Community Theater. Andy has been working at Rosen's since he graduated from State City High School in 1966, back when I had hair, as Andy says. He worked there while attending State University and bought the store from its previous owner, the late Jacob Rosen, in 1986. Just over a year ago, he opened Rosen's Silhouettes, which specializes in formal wear for men and women, as well as bridal gowns. Andy admits that he might be fighting a losing battle in his efforts to persuade more men to wear jackets, ties, and dress shirts, and he wonders how much longer traditional men's stores like Rosen's can survive. It could be that in a few years there won't be any need for a store like Rosen's, he sighs. I'm fighting against a horde of men dressed in shorts, t-shirts, and flip-flops. But, Andy says, il faut imaginer Sisyphe heureux. That French phrase means you have to imagine that Sisyphus is happy. And it refers to the ancient myth of Sisyphus, who was condemned to spend eternity pushing a huge rock up a hill, only to have it roll back down again each time he gets near the summit. Andy says he's single and always looking. He's a lifelong bachelor who lives in a quiet neighborhood on State City's east side. I'm what the French call a vieux garçon, he explains. I never met the right girl. Or maybe it might be more accurate to say that I've met several who I thought might be right, but they all had a different opinion. Anyway, I'm still looking for a nice girl who'd like to run her fingers through my hair. What that feature didn't tell the reader is that Andy Palinkas despised Jim and Gail Wainwright, who up till only a few months before had been his next-door neighbors in that quiet neighborhood on State City's east side. Jim and Gail and their youngest daughter, Christine, had recently moved to a smaller house, more suitable to empty nesters, in another part of town, an event that's pivotal to this tale. Jim and Gail are hard to describe because they are so ordinary looking. They're just a bit younger than Andy. They too are known in State City, and a similar article appeared on them the very next week. Meet Jim and Gail Wainwright. A fixture in downtown State City since 1978, State City Podiatry is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, and Dr. Jim Wainwright says he's looking forward to another 30. Retirement's a long way off, says Jim, 57. I might not literally keep working at this job for another 30 years, but I do hope the practice outlives me. I like to think that I've made myself and my business useful parts of this community. Jim enjoys jokes about his profession, all in good fun. What I like about being a podiatrist, he kids, is that your patients don't die of anything you do to them, and they almost never get well. The best part of my job is getting to meet a lot of people. Your feet might not hurt now, but one day they probably will, and when that happens, if you've seen my ad in the State City Examiner or in the entryway of one or another of the supermarkets around town, I'll be your first call. I hope I'm known as a square-shooting guy who treats everybody right and assumes everyone will do the same. I try to balance the duties of being a wife and mom with my obligations to the community, says Gail, 56. I've never been just a housewife or a stay-at-home mom. I've always kept active by volunteering and getting involved in local politics to some extent. The Wainwrights have 3 children, only one of whom is still at home. David, 31, is already the author of one novel with a second one in progress. He and his wife, Mercy, live in State City and have 2 children, Juliet and Theo. Daughter Melissa, 28, is a school teacher who has just completed her master's degree in education and will be marrying Connor Lowe of State City at the end of July. Daughter Christine, 17, is ready for her last year of high school this fall. I'm almost done, Gail jokes. No, that's not true. Once you're a mother all your life long to all your kids. Among her other interests, Gail lists movies and art, reading, mostly novels and self-help books, gardening, and exchanging ideas with good friends. Her pet peeves include violence in sports, on TV, and in movies, and people who don't fulfill their social responsibilities. I is the least important word in the English language, Gail says, except in the sense of I am responsible to others. Jim admits his tastes aren't as sophisticated as Gail's. I have to admit I enjoy romantic movies, he says. I didn't used to, but Gail usually does the choosing when we go to a movie or rent one, so I've learned to like them. Jim lists Pretty Woman, Autumn in New York, and Like Water for Chocolate as among his favorites. I'm all about chocolate, he said. My favorite dessert is chocolate cake with chocolate frosting, with chocolate ice cream and chocolate sauce on top. But I leave off the chocolate sprinkles if I'm dieting. Our marriage has worked because we share the same values, Gail concludes. That's so important, and so many couples don't understand that when they get married. If they did, there wouldn't be so many divorces. Now you'll note, they've got one child living at home, and she's quite a bit younger than the others. She was their little accident, their little tail ender. And you get the sense that the whole family resents that youngest kid for being born because she came along unplanned at a time when the parents thought they were done with it and when she would be nothing but an inconvenience to her older siblings. And Andy sort of sensed this living next door to them, and he felt a little bit sad about it, but there was nothing he could do. So let's go back in time to when little Christine was pretty much a toddler. In the early spring of 1995, when Christine was 4 years old and Andy would have been about 47, came the incident from which grew Andy's almost obsessive loathing of Jim and Gail Wainwright. If Andy hadn't happened to be washing dishes and looking out of his back kitchen window right when he did, Christine would probably have died. As it happened, his casual glance included the Wainwrights' backyard. He couldn't see fully into that yard because a paled wooden fence surrounded it, but because of the angle he could see the top of the far side of the fence where there was a gate. Andy saw the gate swing open. A few minutes later, Christine Wainwright came into view, sort of half skipping and half prancing the way a girl that age will do, coming around the fence so that she was walking along the periphery of Andy's backyard. A creek runs behind that house and behind the Wainwright's house. It's not a broad creek or very deep, 10 to 12 feet across and maybe 2 feet deep most of the year. It's a long creek that meanders through State City for several miles before feeding into the State River. Where Andy and the Wainwrights lived, there's a bank fairly steep between the creek and the backyards of the houses on either side, so that the surface of the creek at its usual depth is about 10 feet down. Here it was late March, though, and the ice had broken up and the creek was swollen, so it might have been more than 3 feet deep in some places. It did occur to Andy that it might not be a good idea for this little girl to be playing so near a body of water, with no supervision. He watched her for a couple of minutes and wondered whether he should go out there and tell her to get back behind the fence, but she looked like she wasn't doing anything dangerous. Still, it occurred to Andy that now would be as good a time as any to step outside, check out his own backyard, and incidentally make sure that the kid was all right. Maybe remind her to be careful of the water. It was a gorgeous spring afternoon, a Sunday. Andy wasn't a gardener, but he had planted a few bulbs here and there in front and backyards, and he wandered across his backyard now, looking at the crocus and making sure the tulips and the daffodils were beginning to sprout. He heard a rustling near the creek and strolled over to it. To his left, about 50 yards away, he saw Christine standing on the very edge of the bank, poking at some dead leaves on the ground. Then he saw her lose her footing. She shrieked as she slid down the bank into the creek, and Andy shrieked too, falsetto like a woman. That sound, his own, would stay in his mind for the rest of his life. Andy would remember that shriek above everything else in that whole incident, and years later he would feel slight shame at having emitted it. Maybe Andy remembered the shriek because he wasn't thinking about what he did next. He just did what occurred to him to do. He scooted down the bank, slipping more than stepping, and before he was aware of it, he was in the water almost to his waist, and it must have been freezing cold, but he didn't realize it for the instant that it took him to catch Christine and grab her. The current was sweeping Christine right at Andy. She was thrashing, and she couldn't have got by him because he was standing right in the middle of the creek like a shortstop waiting for a ground ball to come to him. Andy fielded Christine, and his instinct was to carry her out of the creek and run with her up the bank. But her clothes were full of water at that point, so she must have weighed twice her normal poundage. Andy tried to pick Christine up as best he could by just grabbing her hold of whatever parts of her he could get a grip of. To lift Christine, Andy had to hug her to him, which meant that his whole body was drenched, and the creek's current was almost strong enough to knock him down. He didn't believe he could walk the couple of steps out of the creek. The mud nearly pulled his shoes off when he tried to take a step, and climb up the embankment while he was carrying a soaking wet 4-year-old girl. So instead of carrying Christine out of the creek, he more or less hovered onto the bank, flung her, as though she'd been a sack of fertilizer. Then he scrambled out of the water as best he could, which was difficult because his trousers had become waterlogged. Christine was starting to roll back down the bank toward the water again, so he had to heave her up the hill, inches by inches, and she was too terrified to help the process. At the top of the hill, Andy had an awful premonition that his hold would slip and Christine would fall back down again. And this time he wouldn't be able to stop her. It took him a good minute to somehow manhandle Christine up onto the dry grass above the embankment to a point where she wasn't going to do that. And at last Andy was able to start scrambling up himself. To get up onto the grass, he had to crawl on his belly because he couldn't get a purchase with his feet. Once onto the grass, he lay prone next to Christine for a few seconds, trying to gather his senses and catch his breath. Andy sat up. He could see that Christine was moving. Her eyes were open, she was sputtering, so obviously she was breathing, which was a great relief to Andy because he wasn't sure he'd have known how to resuscitate her. Andy got to his feet and grabbed Christine again. He picked her up in a bear hug, and she started to shout, not scream, it wasn't loud, and Andy slung her over his shoulder in a fireman's lift and moved towards his back door as best he could, slowly because he was carrying not only Christine but several pounds of water in his clothes. Somehow he got the door open. He carried Christine into his kitchen and set her on the floor. Andy ran into the hallway and up the staircase to the upper floor to a linen closet, from which he dragged out a blanket, then ran with it back downstairs to the kitchen, where Christine was still sitting on the floor looking stunned, not saying anything. Andy wondered whether she was going to go into shock and how he could tell if she were. If he had had his wits completely about him, Andy would probably have carried Christine over to where the gate in the Wainwrights' back fence was still ajar, and carried her through the Wainwrights' backyard, and then pounded on the back door. But as it was, all he could think to do was to carry her, wrapped in a blanket now, out the back door of his house and around his house to the front, where he could beat a tattoo on the Wainwrights' front door. So far, Christine hadn't said anything. Andy carried her up onto the Wainwrights' front porch and hammered on the door with his fist. Didn't knock, but hammered, and hollered, "Open up! Open up! Your daughter fell in the creek!" Only nobody opened the front door for him. Instead, a few seconds later, Andy could hear Gail Wainwright in the backyard calling, "Christine! Christine!" He still had Christine in his arms, and she was still making no sound. Andy ran around to the side of the house to the paled fence and yelled over it, "Gail, over here!" He held Christine up so that her mother could see her over the fence. He had to call twice. Gail had actually gone through the gate on the other end of her backyard. Andy could see the top of her head. She was evidently scouting the banks of the creek. Finally, Andy got Gail's attention, and she ran around the outside of the fence through Andy's backyard so that at last they were face to face, and Andy could hand the bundle to her. Gail moaned, "Oh, Christine, what have you been doing?" "She might be in shock," said Andy. "I'm going to run inside and call an ambulance." "I don't think that'll be necessary," Gail said. But Andy turned and would have run back into his own house, except that when he turned, he was face to face with Jim Wainwright, who had presumably come out the front door of his house in belated response to Andy's hammering. "What?" Jim asked Andy. "What's the trouble?" "Christine had a little accident," said Gail, in what struck Andy as a calmer tone than he might have expected. "She fell into the creek," Andy told Jim, still breathless. "She was out playing back behind your fence, and she slid down the embankment and went in. I got her out. She'd have drowned." "Gosh," Jim exclaimed. "How'd she get outside the yard?" What Andy wanted to do was explain to Jim that she had gotten outside the yard by tripping the latch on the gate and walking out, and that if he and Gail didn't want that to happen, they should get a fucking lock for the gate. But Gail was standing right there, and Andy understood that neither she nor Jim would thank him for saying that. "We ought to call an ambulance," Andy reiterated to Jim, "or take her to the hospital." "I'm sure she'll be fine," said Jim. "Let's get her inside." Jim stepped past Andy, took the blanket-wrapped Christine from Gail, and carried her into their house through the front door. Gail hurried after him. Neither looked back. They must have seen that Andy was soaking wet, but it must all have been overwhelming to them, almost losing one of their children, and the confusion and all. Maybe some people would accuse Andy of having been petty, and indeed he even accused himself of it later on, but at any rate he stood there outside for another minute or so, noticing that he hadn't heard a thank you. Andy scolded himself for being unreasonable and self-absorbed as usual. Jim and Gail wouldn't think to thank him in the heat of the moment, he decided, and he should be ashamed of himself for resenting not having been thanked. Okay, and then there's a short scene where the next evening Jim Wainwright shows up at Andy's door, bringing him the blanket freshly laundered, and thanks Andy for having rescued the little girl, and they shake hands, and that's that. Andy didn't see Gail Wainwright for about a week after that incident, nor Christine for that matter. But on the following Sunday, he and Gail were in their front yards at the same time. Gail was weeding, and Andy jokingly asked her if she'd care to start on his yard next. Then he asked how Christine was. "Fine," said Gail. "No harm done, apparently. Except she won't take baths now ever since that little incident. Jim and I have to force her into the tub." And she laughed. It's fun to find certain people contemptible. It gives you a tingle sometimes to look upon your fellow man and curl your lip in distaste or scorn, or on special occasions utter loathing. But Andy thought about the Wainwrights more than was good for him, and he knew it. He once asked himself, was there a moral horizon that Jim or Gail Wainwright had crossed that made him feel the way he felt? Could he point to a deed or event that was so horrible that it made him say, okay, that's it. That person has crossed the line from being just sort of a jerk to being irredeemably bad. Andy concluded that Gail had crossed that line not when her negligence had allowed Christine to fall into the creek. That had been bad, but Andy could have forgiven it as the kind of mistake that any parent could make. And it was not when she couldn't even thank him for saving her daughter's life. That was shame taking over, and Andy understood about shame. No, when Gail crossed the line was when she told Andy that she and her husband had to force Christine into the bathtub now. That was when she went, in Andy's green eyes, from being a neglectful parent to being a malicious, sadistic abuser. And she'd said Jim and I, which indicated to Andy that Jim was in full collusion. That, coupled with the way Jim, too, had acted immediately following the accident, convinced Andy that the Wainwrights were actively evil. Moreover, Andy decided they were obliviously evil. The Wainwrights, Andy concluded, were a type of sociopath that's never been explored by the academic or clinical communities, because coupled with the pathology of that sort of person is a sort of absolute ordinariness that renders them highly functional in everyday life and this is crucial, keeps them under the radar of evil. So Andy nurses that grudge against Christine's parents, but at the same time, as the years go by, he feels that having saved Christine once, he's sort of responsible for her for the rest of her life, and so he cultivates her acquaintance, becomes her friend, and as a result, he hears an awful lot about the Wainwrights. Mother, father, and the two elder siblings, and of course Christine herself. And the rest of the book is what he learns from these people and about these people. But to find out more, you're going to have to buy it. So now I'll take questions, comments, dirty jokes, anything. Thank you. Thank you.
Joe, how many free copies are you giving out tonight?
Does zero work for you?
Yeah.
Questions or comments?
Did you enjoy writing this book?
Oh my gosh, I loved writing this book. It was just tremendous fun all the way through. A lot of writers, novelists especially, when they're working on a book, in the early part of the process, they'll despair, they'll convince themselves that it's lousy, that it's never going to be any good, that they're wasting their time. I never had a feeling about this one. I knew, even at the stage when I was looking at it and realizing that it was bad, I knew that eventually I would turn it into something good. Yes, honey?
Joseph, what did you feel today when Jeff Chris Carlson described you or compared you with Leo Tolstoy?
When I saw the reference to Anna Karenina and to Tolstoy, I wasn't able to get my hat on my head for quite some time. But I guess it's not going to do my reputation any harm, is it? Sir.
Yeah. What inspired you to write, like in a third person, using the perspective of the man with the bald man?
You know, I wonder about that too. It just sort of happened. I could have done it all in first person, but I wanted somewhat of a remove, and I wanted a suggestion of omniscience, because there are parts of this book where Andy couldn't possibly have known for sure what was going on, but he just has to give it his best guess. And then there are other times when he's pretty sure of what's happened, but maybe doesn't know all the details. So by telling it in the third person, that gets him off the hook a little bit and allows him to be more omniscient than he would have been. I saw a hand at the back. Yes.
I think I read in the Press Citizen that this started off as a National Novel Writing Month book. Can you talk a little about that process of writing in the National Novel Writing Month?
Okay. Well, National Novel Writing Month happens in November of every year, and it's just an informal web-based project where anybody who wants to can participate. And a bunch of writers just agree that each of them in the month of November will do their best to produce 50,000 words worth of novel, which would be about 1/3 of a book this size. And I did that in 2012 and 2013, working on this book. And you just sort of, these writers who are participating just sort of push each other along, provide each other with moral support and so forth. And so I used 2 National Novel Writing Months to crank out each time about 1/3 of the draft, and then the first draft, and then the rest of the first draft I wrote on my own, and then after that there was second, third, fourth. I think I probably went through 13 or 14 drafts, I believe. First draft of anything is always going to stink. Don't ever let anybody read your first draft. About the 4th draft, you can start showing it to people.
Hi, Joseph. I'm glad to have been here. You talk about ordinary people leading very obviously complicated or complex lives. When did these characters show up in your head the first time? It must have been way before you thought about the novel.
Yes, it was long before I thought about the novel. Oh gosh. I guess the idea had been rolling around in my head for, oh boy, 5 or 6 years. And I had this idea for a novel about a respectable looking, but in fact highly dysfunctional family. And then when I moved to Iowa City in 2010, I started meeting other people who started showing up as characters in my notebook. You know, I started taking notes for this novel probably right around 2008, thereabouts. And as the notebook got bigger, so did the cast of characters, and some of them were people that I met from going to all of those concerts and recitals at the School of Music. And at that point, I said to myself, okay, why not make the School of Music a crucial part of this story? I was just going to make it about this family, but then I said, it's going to be even better if I incorporate a university and a School of Music and maybe a few musicians as well. So probably a few members of the School of Music will recognize themselves or recognize other people. Yes?
Do you do a lot of cutting as you work through these various versions? And is that painful if you do have to cut something?
No, it's not usually painful. There's an old saying among novelists that you have to kill your darlings. You'll write a passage or a sentence that you think is just really, really clever and very literary, artistic, whatever you want to call it. And that's what you got to cut out, because guaranteed most readers will see that and they'll just go, he's trying so hard. So some of my darlings probably survived. You'll probably see a sentence or two here and there, because you'll see that in every novel, a sentence or two that you wish the writer had cut out. But I think I did a pretty good job of getting rid of most of the irrelevant stuff. And maybe I'll get better with future novels.
with the assistance of an editor, or did you do all of this yourself?
I didn't bring in an editor until the final stages. After I'd written about 4 drafts or so, I brought in what I called beta readers, people who would read it all the way through and tell me in broad terms what they liked and what they didn't like. But it wasn't until I was pretty nearly satisfied with the whole product that I brought in an editor. And her job was really copy editor, proofreader, rather than a big picture type editor who says, you know, it needs this, it needs that, you need to cut out this character, you need to add this plot device. That sort of heavy editing was not part of the deal. I have a highly inflated opinion of my own abilities, and therefore I didn't need that sort of thing.
More questions or comments?
Doctor, you had one?
Yeah, I was just wondering, in view of the fact that Andy seems to bear similarities to yourself, Joseph.
Except he's taller and bald.
Yeah. So was the event of the child disappearing a true event, or was that a made-up event?
That was a made-up event.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the next novel going to be a continuation of these same characters in any way?
Not all the same characters, but my next novel, which is probably going to come out in the fall of 2016, will be a prequel, so to speak. We're going to see Andy Palinkas as a teenager in the early 1960s, growing up in State City, and maybe when you read that book, you'll get an idea of how he developed his various neuroses. But I'm looking forward to writing that one very much. And then after that, I have in mind another prequel that will visit another of these characters as a younger person.
Is it fair to ask which one?
Well, my next novel will be mostly about Andy, and the one following that will be about a woman named Teresa Blaha, who is a woman about Andy's age, who is pretty much his best buddy in this book. And she is the mother-in-law of the Wainwrights' eldest child. And she also takes a dim view of the Wainwrights. And so a lot of this book is going to be Andy and Teresa meeting up for lunch and gossiping about the Wainwrights and shaking their heads about what a bunch of fools they are. And Teresa Blaha is an interesting person, too. She's very bright. She's one of the wealthiest people in town, very good businesswoman, also very devout Catholic, and her religion informs her behavior a great deal, and she talks about it. Andy is pretty much an atheist, and so they sort of bounce ideas off of each other here and there, and that provides a little bit of intellectual relief, I'd say.
Joseph, I haven't read the book yet, but I wondered, are there other significant ways that State City and Iowa City differ, other than the emphasis on the School of Music? Did you find...
Well, I don't think I do an awful lot of describing the city. There are certain landmarks that you'll recognize, like Rosen's Men's Store, for example. Think Bremer's. Bremer's isn't here anymore, of course. But that's because Andy Palinkas wasn't running it. He'd have kept it afloat. And the Janscom Center, of course, think Hansher. That was a shout out, by the way, to Vance Bourgeli, who, he's dead now, I believe, but he was the director of the Writers' Workshop here for some time in the 1970s, I think, and he wrote several highly regarded novels. He was quite well known, and he wrote a novel called Now Playing at Canterbury, which was set in State City, Iowa, and it was about the opening of the Janscom Center, which of course was Hansher. And it's a wonderful book. I recommend it highly. But I said to myself, well, okay, if you're going to have an imaginary town, why not use Bourget-Lee's town? So that's what I did.
More questions or comments?
May I
Yes, sir.
ask you a real picky question?
Yeah.
Knowing you've written for the Wall Street Journal and other New York papers with essays and whatnot, how the heck did you throw in croci instead of crocuses?
I prefer croci.
I noticed that.
Great
too.
answer.
Because I'm the author and you ain't.
Well, just for that, I ain't buying it.
Anybody else?
If not, the book is Ambitions. And let's thank Joseph Dobrian.